Following Bon Scott's death, AC/DC considered quitting, but Bon Scott's parents encouraged them to continue, said that he would have wanted him to go on with or without. The band decided to continue, and they were trying to find a new vocalist, and after various candidates were considered for his replacement, they later found another singer thanks to Mutt Lange, and in the 70s with Bon Scott's praise, the band brought former Geordie singer Brian Johnson, who was impressed by the band by singing Whole Lotta Rosie and Nutbush City Limits. Johnson would later return for a second rehearsal, and then on March 29, 1980, band leader Malcolm Young offered him the job, which he gladly accepted. And then Brian Johnson became the band's official lead singer on April 1st, 1980. Shortly after Brian Johnson was hired, they began to record their 7th studio album. And then on July 25th, 1980, they released the album called Back in Black, which they say that the album was a tribute to Bon Scott. It was the band's best album as it had the best critical acclaim and it had a lot of great songs on it. In fact, all the songs on that album were great, but the songs like their title song, Shoot the Thrill, Hell's Bells, Have a Drink on Me, You Shook Me All Night Long, and Rock and Roll Ain't Noise Pollution, it had outstanding success, selling a whopping 22 million copies in the United States, and then worldwide they sold 50 million copies. And after that, AC/DC became one of the most successful rock bands in the world, with Back in Black becoming the 3rd best-selling album as of today. Following a very successful Back in Black tour that ended on February 28, 1981, the band began working on their new album, and this will be the final album Mutt Lange produced. For this next album, still kind of the same style as Back in Black did, and then their 8th studio album was called For Those About to Rock, We Salute You, released on November 23, 1981. It had good songs like the title song, Let's Get It Up, Evil Walks, and Spellbound. It sold 4 million copies in the US, and it was the first album to peak at number 1 in the US Billboard charts. It also peaked in Australia at number 3. Though the album didn't get the critical acclaim as the previous two did, it was still well received by critics. After the tour ended in December of 1982, the band wanted to change their style of music on their next album, going raw and simplistic as they can from their early works. Basically, the band planned to strip their sound down from Back in Black and Those About to Rock. Try to go as simplistic as they can from their earlier albums. But by 1983, drummer Phil Rudd was struggling with drugs, alcohol, and problems with Malcolm Young that led to a physical fight. Phil Rudd was fired midway through the next album's recording session, but however, he already completed his drum parts before he was fired. He was then soon replaced by Dio drummer Simon Wright. Mutt Lange didn't produce this album. Instead, the album was self-produced. Their 9th album was called Flick of the Switch, released on August 15, 1983. The album did not get the success as their previous 3 albums did. It didn't sell near as much as Those About to Rock did, only selling 1 million copies in the US, peaking at number 15 in the US Billboard. And then the critics claimed that it was underdeveloped and unmemorable. Even one critic claimed that AC/DC made the same album 9 times, quote unquote. But personally, I enjoy this album with good songs like Rising Power, the title song, Guns for Hire, and Nervous Shakedown. The tour lasted until January 19th of 1985. Then in 1984, they released a compilation album called 74 Jailbreaks, which were 5 songs at the time only available in Australia. In 1985, the band began to work on their next album. After mixed and negative reviews from Flick of the Switch, they decided to have a more powerful sound on their next album, but still keep the rawness and the simplicity. The album was also self-produced, and their 10th album was called Fly on the Wall, released on June 28, 1985. The album was also not successful, only selling 1 million copies and peaked at the US Billboard at 32. The album was criticized for being underdeveloped, sexist, and politically incorrect. However, later in 85, they released a videotape of them, a music tape of them at a bar playing 5 of the album's 10 songs. Now, the album I personally like, with the songs like the title song, Sink the Pink, Shake Your Foundation, and Stand Up. The tour lasted until February 16, 1986. However, it had bad publicity during the tour after the arrest of Richard Ramirez, aka the Night Stalker, where he was an AC/DC fan, and then the song Night Prowler from the Highway to Hell album he claimed that song had made him to commit murder. The band claimed while the song had taken on a murderous connotation by Ramirez, the song is actually about a boy sneaking into a girl's bedroom at night. The next album they released was a soundtrack album for the movie Maximum Overdrive, and it was called Who Made Who, released on May 24th, 1986. The soundtrack sold better than Flick of the Switch and Fly on the Wall combined, selling 5 million copies and peaked at number 33 in the US Billboard. The soundtrack had 3 new songs, the title songs and instrumentals DT and Chase the Ace. And then the album had songs from various other albums. Following the release of the soundtrack, they took a break and recorded their next album in late 1987 and saw the return of producer George Young and Harry Vanda, who produced their first 5 albums in the 1970s. Their 11th album was called Blow Up Your Video, released on January 18, 1988, which was their best-selling album since Those About to Rock, and sold more copies than the previous 2 albums, selling over 2 million copies worldwide and peaking at number 2 in the UK and Australia and number 12 in America. Despite the commercial success and more positive reviews than the previous 2 albums did, though, it still did not have the acclaim and success that Highway to Hell and Back in Black did. Another problem on the tour was rhythm guitarist and band leader Malcolm Young missed most of the tour due to a bad alcohol addiction and not wanting to have the same fate that Bon Scott did, unlike Angus, who has been a teetotaler all his life. And Malcolm was replaced by his nephew Stevie Young. And when the tour ended on November 13th of 1988, Simon Wright left the band and returned to Dio's next album. And then Malcolm Young recovered from his alcohol addiction and returned to the band. They took a break in 1989 and found a new drummer, Chris Slade. As a new decade began, they started their next album with their new producer, Bruce Fairbairn, and had a brand new sound for a modern audience. That album was their 12th album, called The Razor's Edge, released on September 21st of 1990. And that album put the band back into the spotlight, selling 5 million copies and peaked at number 2 in the US Billboard. And the album opens with one of their best songs, Thunderstruck, which becomes a concert and radio staple to this day. Other great songs like Are You Ready, Fire Your Guns, and Money Talk. And then the tour lasted until November 16th of 1991. The tour was so successful that the concerts almost always sold out, and then in 1992 they released a videotape called Live at Donington, which was a sold-out concert at Donington Park on August 17th, 1991, which had 72,500 spectators. They also released a live album, AC/DC Live, which had songs played during the tour. Then, a year later, in 1993, they released one of their famous singles for the movie Last Action Hero called Big Gun, which peaked at number 1 in the charts.